Welcome, everyone. It's a special session with David Bodman from Australia today, and he is speaking about learning life from the inside out. And as this day unfolds, I think you will find that David has, in a sense, an exemplary path in living life, bumping into the principles, and making really good use of that. In my opinion, one of the most important things that we can do in the Three Principles community is actually to record the voices and stories and perspectives of people from all around the world so that we can supplement the publications and the presentations and trainings in the future. And in today's session, I think you'll discover that David has experiences that fall in many professions. For example, as I listen to his story, I would say that educators might have, if they'd known David as a young child, young teenager, might have said he was one of those at-risk kids that might have had a very rough path throughout all of life. And yet we see an incredible turnaround so that with a history of learning the principles, then moving to teaching the principles, then becoming a business consultant working with organizations around the world, writing a online newsletter, Principles in Business, and finally today doing his consultancy with the simultaneous experience of living with advanced cancer. He's one of the folks that I really look to as saying, when we want to know what the principles look like as that understanding unfolds in someone's life, David is, in a sense, an ordinary person that documents that story. And I'd like you to know how David and I met each other. Today, we're connecting people from all parts of the globe. And David is in Australia. I'm in Minnesota. Brett is in England. Christian McNeil, who is our special discussant today, is in Glasgow, Scotland. And just getting the time zones right for all of us so that we knew when to connect today was a challenge. I met David online in his newsletter approximately 2.5 years ago. And the fact that he was writing a newsletter is an amazing thing in his life, as you will learn. But coming with a background in academic university resilience research, that is the study of it, and the personal learning and professional practice of the principles, I read very carefully. And I came to your newsletter, David, and you had written something about resilience. And I have a bit of a reputation for being, shall I say, a nerd. I read things and I think, is that quite right? No, that's a little off from what I know. So I wrote him a little tiny note thanking him for his newsletter and then saying, I think there's more to this subject of resilience than maybe was reflected in the last issue. And instead of being put out, David was wonderful. He responded back and he said, well, would you like to begin writing for my newsletter? And I thought, now that's a confident person. And it was with that and a very vague recollection from many years before that, where I had seen him at a Three Principles conference, that he and I started to connect. And I really have to thank David for giving me that opportunity to stretch my mind and to write on a regular basis. But I'm not important in this. I want you to meet David. And so, David, I know that you do a far better job of introducing yourself to this wonderful group today than I do. What do you want us to know about the path that you have walked as you have been learning life from the inside out?
Well, thank you, Kathy. Your little introduction on Supermind was, who is this guy? Because obviously you don't see yourself as others do. Mm-hmm. And that's critical to every experience that we all have. And by the way, I'm going to have a little coughing spats because it's a little cooler these days and I get a bit of a cough. I've got a bit of something on the chest. I've had that since the beginning of chemo, so it's just part of life at the moment. So I'll keep the good juices going, cold water or warm water, and see what we can do. Rather than introduce, go through all the credentials, I'd like to start really, as Kathy said, right back, and I'll give you a very brief history because I think it was critical for me, because I'm just amazed how crappy my life was back then. And I was the creator of it. And I did a very good job of it. And my family, I've got a brother and a half-sister. My half-sister's died of some years ago. And it was just, it's not that I had a bad family life. In fact, I had a relatively good one. My dad was in both World Wars, and, we had Anzac Day yesterday, which was a reminder of the terrors he had to face in the trenches. And he came back a very wounded guy. So I've never been hugged by him. I've never been told that I've been loved. And he refused, I found out later, for my mother to do that. Mm. So you can see that it's not that I wasn't loved. He saw doing things for me. And that was one of the toughest things, was for him to go to a prestigious college, which was only a 10-minute walk from our house. And he said, and it was run by the Christian Brothers. And he said, first of all, he got my older brother in. He's only 3 years older. And he said, look, I want him to, my younger son, and my first name is Jeffrey. He said, I want Jeffrey to come also. Well, I remember that day when he, said, you're going to that college. And I was overwhelmed with anger. Mm. It was the first time I've ever really felt angry. And I was, what would I say, 5? I would have been 7, 8, probably 9 years old. And why I was angry was I didn't want to go to that college to become a snob. Because, you had to wear the blazer and the tie and the little skull cap and all that stuff. And I just riled against that. So it was just a culture shock. It wasn't me, as it were. But he insisted. And why he insisted, and that's his love, he wanted me to have the best education possible. Well, the sad thing is, I had a severe learning difficulty. And after 14 years of education, I came out illiterate and innumerate. So, and they always put it down as laziness, not working hard enough, all those sorts of things in those days. Well, I learnt to be a hider, duck under the system, keep quiet. But it was a day in, day out humiliation for me, particularly in the primary school, because you had spelling lists every day, you had mental arithmetic every day, you had this every day, you had to stand up and read every day. And of course, many of the comments, you know, how many did you get right today? None. Oh, sit down, you must. And you were sent out to learn the day's list with one of your peers. And of course, how many mental did you get right? 1 out of 12, you know, all that. And it was every day standing up. It was humiliation. So there's, from that background, there was no joy in any aspect of school other than gymnastics. They had a gymnastics club, and that's the only survival mechanism I had, because I was a relatively good and fit young guy. I moved into rather competitive. I was competing in both state and between colleges. And I wasn't very fantastic, but I was competent. And then I got into the love of coaching my peers. I really loved the energy of sharing what I could see would improve their life. So it was a great opportunity to sort of ground myself in some, you know, in modern terms, they talk about self-worth and self-esteem. Well, that was the only place, really, that gave me any sense of that. All the rest, it was a nightmare. And you can imagine. Kathy?
If I can make a comment, you're saying that on your own, you found yourself knowing that you could coach others.
Yes.
And you're talking about as a young person in athletic events. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. This is important because if I think of nothing other than resilience research, there's always this focus on listening to the young person and having them tell us what their, quote, spark inside, their wisdom, their calling is. You found that without anybody trying to even ask you about it, it sounds to me.
No, that's correct.
No, that's amazing.
So it was, and it wasn't out of desperation. It was a true sense of getting out there and doing what I see that I love doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that led me to go on coaching clinics. And here I was, a 15-year-old then, amongst adults, how to learn and teach and be a good gymnastic coach. And then I got, over a couple of years, what they call an international coaching certificate. And that wasn't about the certificate. It was about making sure that I've got good skills of coaching. And I remember once going to a clinic where a Russian gymnast from the Olympics came over. Well, I had to get to that. So I got there, and it was a 2-day, I think it was a 2-day residential. Now, remember, humiliation in the classroom converted some really wacky ideas in my head. So, for example, if I stood in a line and people went around and introduced themselves, I would have a panic attack, because it's leading up to me, and I just got overwhelmed by the time it got to me to just say I'm Jeffrey Bodman and I'm from Ross River College, and I just froze. I got stuck. So it was all that sort of stuff. And the other thing was that I was a terrible social fear. And here I was in a group. I felt confident in that sense, which I'll come back to, I hope, to see that you can the principles are not in play when you learn them. They're in play all your life. It's not when we get a little certificate from going to a course. It's really when we have it in our lives and embedded in our lives with a deep appreciation of where life is emanating from. So when I had these experiences, I went to this clinic, and this Russian, very poor English, he did things that amazed me in terms of coaching. And what he did was he put, a horse is pretty high, and he would reduce the horse down to a very low level so you can really get your body in the right position when you're going over the horse, or when you're doing the rings. The mat is very close to you, so your feet actually can touch the floor, so you're building strength and all these great ideas. Well, I was a person in a lolly shop here, because I just loved that, and that just blew my creativity. It just initiated it all. It gave me a rich permission to think outside the box. Mm. So it was just saying, it doesn't, you don't need to keep any rules. You just see what can be an injury to them and prevent it from happening, and help their body learn how to deal with their strength and their flexibility. Mm-hmm. And I just took that away, and I did all sorts of things. Kids were, they were laughing at me, but I knew what was asked. I was asking of their body and their physical nature. So that's a sort of a brief little thing up to about 18 or 17. And my father died when I was 17. And to tell you the truth, it was release time from prison. I could leave school because I knew he would keep me going to the school until I went to year 12, what's equivalent to year 12 over here, matriculation in those years. And I would have left school at year 7 if I could.
I think this is an important point, listen to the words David is describing, especially for those of you that think about the principles in education or as we work with youth. And that is that he's saying that it was as if he was let out of prison when he could make the decision that he didn't need to stay in school anymore, and that he had found his sweet spot, his knowing that he had it in him to be a marvelous coach and bring things out of other young people. So after your father died, what did you end up doing?
Well, I had no skill set other than in tenacity. So my father was part of the First and Second World War and part of the Legacy Group. And the Legacy Group found me employment. And I was a store person in Royal Adelaide Hospital. And that's a prestige name. I was a trolley boy. That's basically what I was doing. I was taking things around to each of the wards. First and foremost, I was taking in the morning food, bundled. We had to pack sugar, barley, lollies, milk, all those sorts of little supplies for each of the wards. And that's what I did. Put up this, and there was a guy called Brian, and he was a, how could I say, huge guy, lovely guy, but had intellectual difficulty. And he was the stronger one, so he'd pull and I'd push this fairly large trolley, and I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Now, what I loved was being independent. And the other thing that I loved was in the afternoon, I was given all these jobs. Would you deliver this to the dental department? Okay, where's the dental department? So it was this wonderful learning to find out more about hospital, where all these nook and cranny little places. And there was a guy just a little older than I, and his name was Tony. And Tony knew everything about the hospital and all the annexes and all the nooks and crannies. And there was a bit of a competitive streak in me. And I said, I am going to be like him. So that's what happened. I went off and I learned and there was a guy in charge of the landing and in fact the whole area, and his name was Vic. And he said, oh, look, I'll have to wait for Tony to come back for this one. I said, why? And he said, oh, I don't think you'll know where this is. And I said, what is it? And I can't remember what he said. It could have been the oncology department or somewhere else. And I said, oh, I know where that is. And he said, oh, do you? So on the way back from everywhere, I just noticed, now this is still not being able to read very well. In fact, I found out later I had the reading age of a 7-year-old. So I was just taking note of all sorts of strange letters and words and stuff. So I loved that exploring and getting into finding out beyond the edges of the workplace. Now, you could make that a boring job, but it wasn't.
You know, David, what's really interesting about that from a resilience research perspective is that the researchers will say that when young people end up, I'll say, manifesting resilience, doing things that are pointing back, saying that they have a resilient capacity, curiosity is a major factor. And that's what I hear you talking about. Again, that's from the inside out. And it's really laying the foundation for later fit with the principles. So from that hospital job, how did you navigate into the next stage?
Well, I have no idea. I went back to the college and taught the kids gymnastics after school and on weekends, and took the club to their competitions. And I taught them after school, particularly after 5:30 when I got home. And I was also doing, the college has a residential side to it. So I taught the kids from 7:30 to 8:30 as well, for those who were interested. And after that, I met up with a guy, Brother Tom Roberts, and he and I used to talk for hours while he was bedding them down. I'd sit in his office, and then we have this conversation. And then he said, "Why don't you become a Christian brother?" And I said, "It's quite obvious to me. I can't read, can't write, can't do anything, all the can'ts." And he said, "Oh, well, that can't be much of a problem." And I said, "Well, it is to me." And he got me onto what they call the vocation director. And the vocation director is Brother Tony Daly. And Tony was a strange character because he was what I would call the true Irishman. He always broke rules, and he went around rules. So what happened was that he started to mentor me in. He took me over to the novitiate in Melbourne. That's where we did it. And I was living in Adelaide. Went over there several times. And then the next stage, and this is the hard bit, I had to go back to school. And in fact, there was a second Christian Brothers school, St. Paul's in Strathmont. So I went over there.
So to become a Christian brother, you needed to enroll basically in school again at the university level.
No. At year 10, 11.
At year 10.
Secondary level. And I was 20 at that stage.
Oh my goodness.
So I had this experience of life. I said, "Oh, I don't know about this." So I did. I said, "Okay." And in fact, I had an independent means. I had my own car, paying it off. So I did that. And I can remember the first day. I drove there an hour early, and I was welded to my seat in the car. I could not get out. And one of the other things about this is that I was slightly different in dress, because they said, "Well, get the pants, and you've got black shoes. That's fine. You don't have to get the grey shirt. You can get the white. You can keep white shirts." I had several white shirts, and I thought, "Oh, okay." Of course, after this absolute welding at the seat, I just had to, and I got out the car and walked over. I knew what class I was going to, because previous day I went there and they introduced me to the area and all that. And I went into the class and they all stood up, thinking I was the teacher. And I thought, "Oh God. I couldn't reverse, and I said, where's a desk? And they all pointed to the teacher's desk, and I said, no, oh, I can see one down the back. So I went down the back, and they were all stunned, as I was. So that was my first day of going back, re-entering. Well, I won't go through the nasties of the year, but I only did marginally better. I got one subject out of the 5. I don't even know what that subject, I think it was geography, if I remember rightly. So that was my proof. I had my badge of honour. Again, gymnastics came in. They had a gymnastics team, and I taught them there. And it was a hell on earth again. But I think the teachers were kinder then. And I suppose a little bit more respectful of my age and reason why. Now, the kids didn't know why I was coming back. They just all thought it was a curiosity until probably the last week of the end of the year. And one found out that I was going to be a Christian brother, and they all, whoa. It was sort of seen as somewhat of esteem. But can you see the craziness of all this?
Yes, for sure. So you had to complete basically secondary school, work through all of that old emotional baggage, the social hesitancy and so on. And then eventually you were at the point of being an official Christian brother.
Well, and this is where the mystery, I do not understand how they took me in. In fact, if you were to take it in the modern world, you would have to have so many points, academic points to get in anything. Well, I didn't have any. So it was, I don't know. And that's where Brother Tony, I think he did a bit of skullduggery there. I had no idea what was going on, but I turned up, and that was the start. And I packed my bags, I think, 4 times during the year ready to leave. The first time I remember, there was a lovely guy, forgotten his name now, but he was a very big scholar in biblical studies. And that was one of the units that I did. And he put out what we had to do for the semester. And we had to do 2 assignments. One was a 3,000-word essay on Genesis 1 to 11. And the other was a 3,000-word essay, including bibliography, footnotes, blah, blah, blah. As soon as I saw that, I couldn't put 3 words together, and I was ready to go.
Wow.
So that was a difficult year, but I had fellow colleagues that really supported me. There was one in particular, Don Wedd. He just supported me right through. He showed me how to write an essay for a start. I learned how to type, and that really increased my ability to spell for one strange reason. The novice master said, I think you ought to go and get tuition from it was a Miss Bishop, and she was lovely, absolutely lovely. She took me on as an adult rather than a child, as not a diminished child learning, but you've got this amount of learning, and we want to stretch that out. So it was she was lovely. So I went there on a weekly basis. And then this was a 3-year teaching degree. And it wasn't until the last semester of the 3rd year, the director said, "Oh, we haven't got your academic records from your secondary school." I wonder where that went. And I said, "Well, I can tell you straight off, I could send home for them, but I think I got one subject out of 5. And he looked, I could see the eyes of aghast. He was just overwhelmed that even I got in. And he said, "Well, we can't do anything about that. Please get them sent over. But you've proven yourself on the way. So we can't do anything about the past. We can only say what we've got right now." So that was just a fortuitous and thrilling moment for me. So
You got to skip jail.
I did.
Right around the board. Yeah. So how long were you in the Christian Brothers, and what did you do professionally while you were there?
Well, and I'll shorten all this down. 30 years I was in the Brothers. And in the first 2 years I was in the normal classroom, and that was hell on earth. I mean,
and it was required that you had to become a teacher. You had no other choice. Is that
no
right?
other choice. In fact, Tony said you could become a lay brother. And that's why I thought I was, the couple of years beforehand, they closed that gate. They said, no, every brother must become a teaching brother. So it's very interesting, skullduggery, as I call it.
So you became a classroom teacher.
Now, my first 2 years, the kids were brighter, smarter, and knew more than I did. I wasn't fit to teach. I was fit to be an educator. And there's a distinction between the two. And so rather than me read to the class, I got the ones that really wanted to read. I asked them to read some what I call classic stories to them. And I got reading clinics with parents and all those sorts of things. I always kept probably one step in front of them in terms of maths. I'm still pretty lousy in maths. So there's a lot of stuff that, and then I moved into what we call the institutional care cycle. And that is, we had a pretty established and well-recognised behaviour modification program. It was a residential program, and I put up my hand and I said I'd love to get involved in that, because that had the one of the things that are about religious groups, they have a vision and they live the vision. You've got such a strong visionary core, and it's somewhat sad. That was one of the reasons why the disconnect grew over the 30 years. So I went into that institution for 5 years, and some of these kids, I mean, they went through juvenile jails and all sorts of stuff. Some of them were, I would call them schizophrenic, and we didn't know that at the time. We were just dealing with whatever we dealt with. Highly dysfunctional kids, but I loved it. I loved the challenge. I loved the engagement. I loved the honesty of the kids. I had some rather odd, they call it odd, ways of educating them. Is what I call, when they came into my class, I gave them probably a wad of 25 pages, and it was made up of simple mathematics, simple sentence construction, those sorts of things. And by the way, I was doing a graduate diploma in special education at that stage during that 5 years. So, and on the flip side of that was colouring in, dot to dot, puzzles, all that sort of said. And I said, I don't care what you do that side or do the other side, didn't worry me. Of course, they always started with colouring in, dot to dot, puzzles, that sort of stuff. But they were enticed to get over the other side and do those who could. And that's what I call, when kids are traumatised in that sense, they've gone through, one child in my class actually went through every school and would not be accepted in any school in Perth. Because he, excuse the language, he said fuck off, or throw a tantrum. He would throw chairs and tables, and he was quite violent, not to other students, but certainly to the material, chairs and tables, and sometimes punch the door and that sort of stuff. And he was one of my favourites.
David, what I find interesting is that when we think back to your own challenges in school and your very low reading level and the social emotional challenges that you felt, and then you end up, as life unfolded, you end up actually teaching special ed students. And again, like you were doing coaching, it was coming from something natural inside of you. It sounds to me like that was very powerful. As you moved on with Christian Brothers, how did you begin to bump into the principles? How does that fit into this picture?
Well, I was still a Christian brother when I went through that, and I had a year of study, and then I went in charge of a primary school for 5 years. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of that year, they were asking for people who were interested in exploring juvenile justice in Perth. Well, I stuck my hand up immediately and said, look, I'd be only too happy to do that. So they sent me off, and I did my own trail. I went to every child's court in Perth. I went to all the juvenile detention centres and jails. I went on the street for 2 years. There's all those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. So it's a rich time. And then I managed a program called Arrest Express Youth Advocacy Service for young people who got arrested by police, because police were very, very harsh on kids on the street. And I won't go into the detail of that. Mm-hmm. And then I went, from there on, I went into drug and alcohol counselling. I finished a psych degree in 96, and I was also doing what they call volunteer drug and alcohol training, and that part of that was to I suppose you've got to give 100 volunteer hours for that training. Mm-hmm. And that's what I did. Mm-hmm. And
I find it interesting that in this whole 30 years, you were continuing to be a student in a variety of educational programs.
Absolutely.
That too fits with the resilience research that shows that when resilience is tapped and realized in someone's life, there is a trail of what we would call lifelong learning. That curiosity shows up. And I think that's very characteristic of what we see when we listen to others who have learned the principles. So the transition from the Christian Brothers to Three Principles, what was that like?
Well, see, and this is the thing I think I mentioned to you, Kathy, there is no in one sense, no transition, because we are all immersed in the three principles all the time, even without some academic understanding or training or whatever. And Roger Federer raises to mind, he's such a calm, engaged, integrated human being. He knows the principles inside out, but he wouldn't have a clue what I would be talking about is mind, conscience and thought. He just lives it. And I've met many parents, kids that have got this, what you might call resilience, but what I call is a fundamental knowledge or knowing of the three principles lived in life. And that's
making a really significant statement, because at a time when the world is active with, I'm going to say, formal, planned opportunities for both teaching and learning the principles, you're talking about what it is like to recognize the principles as naturally in operation in every human being's life, and to trust that they have, I'll say, a natural knowing of that. Your story is a bit dramatically clear because you can point to specific moments in time and talk about when you knew you were confident, for example, to do the coaching or to do the teaching with the special ed students. So when you began to learn the principles, what's in a formal way, how did
that occurred? I was introduced by my supervisor, my psych supervisor, to say, look, the way you actually work with clients, I think you ought to go over to John Wood. He runs a little group, a 10-week course, and I think you'll love it. So that's when I was introduced. I went over. It was a 10-week, 2-hour course. I think it was philosophy of everyday living or something like that. Yeah. And I remember the first evening very well, because he started off and said, look, this is not something you can learn academically. You can, but that's not the fundamentals. And he asked people not to take notes. Well, I'm a note taker from way back. So I've got my pad here and I'll be taking all the pearls of wisdom down as if they are going to be my resource. But he was asking to put it down, and he noticed I was cheating a little. And he said, David, I don't want to admonish you here. It's just, could you just leave your pad alone and just experience that? And I said, oh, yeah, okay. So that's what happened. And that was probably the first crunch moment where learning was not academic. It was a natural evolving thing within you.
So
And
you had come home to the kind of learning you had been doing on your own
exactly,
from the time you were young until now.
exactly. So it took the 10 weeks to at least give me a glimpse. Now, the fundamental one, core idea was innate health. Because I could go back, I was demonic, I was evil, I was dumb. I held that for probably 35, 36 years, maybe even longer.
Mm.
So there was a book that I read that liberated my idea. I could see for the first time thought. And that book was called The Original Blessing by Matthew Fox, I think is one.
Mm-hmm.
And he was a priest who took there's two creation stories in the Bible. One comes with Adam and Eve and the apple or the fruit and all that sort of stuff, and original sin. And the other was you are born and in the image of me. You are all gods. And that was the start of rattling that new insight, that I could think for myself. I could start to see things differently. And that was a very important moment for me. And that probably happened 10 years prior to the program. And this innate health resonated with Matthew Fox's book. And that's what I saw with kids, and adults for that matter, because there were sometimes I had to, in particular the administration area, I had to let people go, as they call it over here, fire them, because they just weren't not only performing but didn't have the spirit of the place in their sights.
Mm-hmm.
So I did that a couple of times, those sessions
With John.
with John, and then that was in 96. 97, John started the centre here, which was started as the Psychology of Mind Resource Centre, and he was pretty industrious, and he put look, I couldn't. He never admit, but he would say at least a couple of $1 million into the enterprise. So
for those of you who haven't been familiar with the history and role of the Psychology of Mind Resource Center, which was in Australia, and then there was a branch in Bend, Oregon, am I correct? And Alan Flood was managing that. That history is documented in Jack Prancey's recent History of the Principles book. It was at that time that both David and I were partway into learning the principles. And that resource center was very important. It had not only print materials, but audio tapes by a number of the people who are still teaching the principles today, as well as a whole series of 20-some tapes by Sid Banks. So those were available for sale, very minimal costs at that time, not the whole of his tapes, but that set of 20-some at that time. So with Psychology of Mind Resource Center there in Australia, what roles did you end up playing?
Well, I did it part-time as a Christian brother, um, and I did that mainly in the afternoon and late evening. I ran a course and I did one-on-one. And that was, what was her name? I've forgotten her name now. Gosh. She came over for 1 year from Canada, I think. And she was the clinical director. And John, I must say, was very generous in terms of bringing her over for a start and setting her up in a house for a year and all those sorts of things. He was very generous to bring Judy Sedgman, Keith Blevin, Jack Pransky, Joe Bailey. God, there was several others that I can't remember.
There were rich resources. I mean,
Yeah.
Valuable resources brought to Australia at that time
Yep.
by the generosity of John. And then your own role grew.
And then I moved into full-time 2002, and that was as a clinical director of the place, because there were Carol Ringgold, that's it. Carol Ringgold was the clinical director. He wanted some psychological expertise in the area.
And Carol was very well qualified. She was one of the first to write a PhD dissertation about the principles, and sadly passed a number of years ago, but she had a significant role.
Absolutely. So, and I took over when she left, and I suppose to 2006, I took on both that clinical role, also one-on-one coaching, group training, and we did have a corporate arm as well. Mm-hmm. So all those we got involved with, and we shared and Rolf Klausnisser was another person, and the three of us worked. Rolf left a couple of years before we closed the centre. So, yeah.
It's a very significant and active period, and as the rest of that history gets explained in Jack's book, people can follow it there. But once that center closed, you carried on. Is that right?
Yes, there was an invitation by John to take on the centre, and I just didn't feel comfortable to do that at that stage. Part of the training that we did was also practitioner training. I felt that I wasn't ready. Right. And so one of our clients, in fact, who was an accountant's firm, one of our clients who used to come every week, and John and myself used to coach him because he was one of the principals of this large accountant's firm. He said, "I'll bring you over." So he employed me in and created a little business entity called Dimension 4 Consulting. And that's when I did 2 years there. Well, again, I said, his name was Mal. I said, "Mal, I'd be happy to do that, but I know I'm not prepared to put in," and I knew very early that it was going to be very time consuming. I used to be out of the house by 6, and sometimes I didn't get back to 9 p.m. And I said, "I just can't. I've done that, been there, and I just don't want to do that anymore." So that's when I finished up, and that's it. Went into principles in business, run my own little consultancy, and excuse me.
No problem.
And I did relatively well, I think, insofar as I work with financial groups. There's a place, an organisation, iNet over here, which is consumed into, Westnet, and it was assumed into a bigger organisation called iNet. And I worked with their leadership team of, I think, 15 for one day over 5 months. And I worked with construction, housing construction groups. I'm at the moment working with a land sales group. So there's quite a variety. In fact, I'm dangerous because I can apply this to the teaching area, corporate area. It doesn't matter where it is. I can apply what I understand, and that's the beauty of moving from an academic understanding to a lived experience. And
you can see it in front of your eyes.
The only area I sort of tend to steer away from is family and friends. I prefer to be family and friend.
That's good. And in a moment, I'm going to ask Christian to engage in some discussion with you in whatever area strikes her as being pertinent. It's interesting to me that you had so many years living, in a sense, in your own world and making sense out of things so that you could do things successfully, and then understanding that the inside out was really with you. I know that the spiritual, whatever one means by that, has always been very important to you. And I recall you telling me one day, one of the things you liked most about being a part of the Christian Brothers was when you would have those week-long retreats where you were just silent and alone. And I think at that point, I'm going to pick your brain a little bit, Christian, because you've been involved with David and his writing, which now we can see is very surprising. That coming from his history, he could be producing newsletters, thinking about a book, all of those kind of things. What has struck you over the years, Christian, that you have been engaged with David from a distance?
Well, one thing is it's a total, although we've shared a lot, David, about anything that comes up, and for anyone that doesn't know, we kind of stumbled across each other along with Alan and have been involved in maybe monthly or bi-monthly group on Skype or Zoom. We've shared an awful lot, each of us, about our every aspect of our lives. I had no idea that you had that issue with learning at school, none whatsoever. Nothing that came out in our conversations would have given me any clue about that. Really quite the opposite. I thought you were probably more of an academic and scholar than I was. So that's been interesting. And I was just thinking how fortunate I am to have stumbled across you and Alan. This association has gone on for something like 3 years. And these really deep, rich calls. And I could feel myself when you were speaking there, David, just going into that kind of slightly trancy zone that sometimes, even though we're just having the three of us a conversation, I go into in our conversations. And it's been absolutely magical. There's been no, it's just sharing, giving and taking. There's no financial element. It's just been, I just felt how privileged I am to have had both of you share your experience, your wisdom, and also the history of the principles. It's been fascinating to me that, the unvarnished truth. And I mean, I think, we can handle that. It's interesting. It makes it more real. It has been, as well as being a massively powerful spiritual understanding that touched so many lives. Human beings have been involved in egos and factions, and that's been fascinating for me too, to learn all about that. I'm really unvarnished is the word. It's not a gloss. There's no overstatement or no pretending that people are all saints or something. But nevertheless, the power of this, the transformative power of this, is phenomenal. And I mean, we've touched on some really deep stuff about what Sid saw, what his experience was, and how. And it's through my conversations with you, David and Alan, that I've come to see that we're really, I believe, really privileged. I didn't meet Sid; he died just before I came to the principles. But even so, being so close to this powerful happening, this powerful Sid's enlightenment experience, it feels like a tremendous privilege to me. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. And I really feel that you've been a kind of guide and mentor through that, and have enabled me to fully, not fully, more fully grasp something of that. And I just, I really just, treasure your friendship, and I've been very touched at times by some, what's going on for you at the moment. And I know if I dwell on that for too long, I'm going to start crying, and I don't want that. Maybe it doesn't matter if we have that or not. I really treasure those moments. I think that's enough out of me, Kathy. Thank you. And it's been wonderful to meet you, which is also through David.
It's a wonderful opportunity that Supermind and all of technology has brought to us, because back in the 90s, there was none of this.
Absolutely.
It took us weeks and months, and sometimes we had to wait for conferences to even connect. But David, do you wish to make a comment following Christian in some way? I have another question for you, but.
One of the things that, and I may go into the recent cancer stuff.
Yeah.
The question here is that I remember Sid saying, and I think it was on a recorded message somewhere along the line I've seen, the hero is within. Let's not romanticize the wonderful life that I may have lived or others have lived, and put them on a pedestal as a way to live. Each of us have got to be guided from the inside out to live that noble life that we're all had the capacity to do in a flash. It doesn't need to take 30 odd years to get the flash. It can be done in a moment. And I think my life, although it can be a testimonial, let's make it really an ordinary expression of what every human being has not only the right, but the capacity to bring to their lives every day of their life. And as that wonderful film, I'll Have What She's Eating, well, it's an infectious sort of reality, as long as we as mentors or facilitators or coaches point back to their inner being. It's them. It's not about me. It's not about, in fact, it's not even about the principles. It's about what they are realizing about their life and living. And I use the word learning life. You notice I don't learning living. Life is a big thing that happens, and I use life rather than mind. It's simultaneous, it's interchangeable, but it's life is just is. And if we can really live that life, more engaged with that life, then, well, it seems a lot easier.
Yeah. You know, you made a really significant statement there just a minute ago when you're saying, for you, you use the word life rather than mind. And a few days ago when we were chatting, I asked you, how do you see the spiritual? And you said, well, all of life is spiritual. Yeah. For those of you who are listening in, we'll welcome your comments and questions, and all you need to do is, raise your hand in the process. And until you're ready to ask a question, we'll continue this discussion here. I'm kind of struck by the fact, as we're talking today, that in the rather recent past, we know that Sid Banks experienced cancer, Carol Ringel experienced cancer, Roger Mills did, I have a diagnosis, you have a diagnosis, many, many, many people do. And to keep one's head about oneself when that label comes to rest on your shoulders. What do you say about that, David?
Well, that's an interesting one. Well, I think it's summed up. I had a conversation just past week with a colleague that was at the centre, and I hadn't met her for probably 5 or 6 years. And we met up, and her name's Gabrielle. Mm-hmm. And the opening line was, "How are you coping?"
Yeah.
And I said, "I'm not coping." And she looked at me and with a sort of a drawn look. I said, "There's nothing to cope about. There's nothing to cope. It's not determining how I live my life. It has impact. Like every fortnight, I've got to turn up to the hospital and have 5 hours of intravenous chemotherapy and the following 2 days of mobile chemotherapy. And it's not a pretty feeling for days later. And you get these little coughs. And just recently I was put on a new protocol because the first protocol didn't work. And the question I asked, how many protocols have I got left? And he said, not many. In fact, this is it. I said, okay. And so there's some people might think it's denial. Some people might think I take a very practical way of looking at things here. But it just seems like I just want to have a life worth living now. It's not about being determined to get over things or whatever. Now, do I need to change certain things? Yes. I haven't got the energy to run sometimes a full-day session. In fact, I've signed up with Georgina Maver, a friend of mine and colleague over here, for a 2-day session in July, a 2-day program. I've just started the meetup group over here, and that's every month. And usually it's the Saturday after my treatment, which I look like Gasper the Ghost. I look white as, but that it won't stop me from doing what I need to do and see what I need to do. And also, like today, yesterday, I wasn't very smash on. In fact, I was quite poor. So I went out into the garden, did some potting, and it just seems like it's helpful to do that. So it's not going to determine how I live my life today. Mm-hmm. And that's probably one of the understories of my life, is being dumb or uneducated wasn't going to determine how I was. Mm-hmm. Christian, you made mention that, you thought I was a bit of an academic. Well, I am. I do, and that can be a danger because you can put too much in your head and go to the intellect rather than your common sense and wisdom. And that's been another little thing that I had to learn along the way.
Would you like to leave us with some closing words? We hope one day in the future we'll be able to do another session where you talk about your evolution as a coach, which is also very interesting, how you went from teaching the principles in a certain kind of way to a much more formless manner. But what occurs to you as we come to a close today?
I've talked to Elsie Spittle several times about what Sid brought was a new language of an old story. Mm-hmm. It's been around forever. There's a wonderful 13th century mystic, Messer Eckhart, who talked about the thought of God and the divine idea. And God is. And all these rich ways of expressing what you might call the unable, or you're unable to really speak your experience, but you know it. For me, there is no, I believe in what you might call the 3 principles. I know the 3 principles. Big difference. Mm-hmm. And when you know that, you've got, like, for example, cancer is a terrible disease, particularly the one I have. It's pancreatic cancer, and it hasn't got a good track record. In fact, it's got a woeful one. I just have an idea of spontaneous remission. Now, that doesn't mean that I will have one, It just means I've got it in my sphere of consciousness. And if I've been listening to certain tapes or podcasts over here from a program called All in the Mind, and there was one on cancer victims, and it was amazing how many feared going to scans because they didn't want to know what it ended up like. It just doesn't worry me. Same with blood tests. Same with my first protocol. I must have been 5 times in hospital for small bouts of 3 or 10 days because of infection. But I often talk about hospitalisation as a retreat time. It's a time to just to be present, as Bertie talked about, as opening the door and smelling the fresh air, or I used to get up and walk around the ward. So I just loved to be engaged in whatever I could. So as I say today, has the principle saved my life? No. But it has given me an understanding that has enriched my understanding from my previous life. It's what I call joined all the dots for me, where I had a patchwork of ideas and stuff. It really unified it all.